MB, the Office of Management and Budget, as the Associate Director. And he was managing the budget of the Department of Energy, Department of Interior, EPA, and USDA, all together. That came in very handy later on. And after the Obama administration, he was here as a pre-port energy scholar, teaching out here, co-teaching with Paul McIntyre on energy policy.
Which is great. I just feel sorry for myself. Young kid, but brilliant. I do also remember he decided to go to law school, and I lied about him and said he was great. And he went to Georgetown. But I think he's now got very big responsibilities, and this is really, in my view, it's a job that has to coordinate many agencies. The Department of Energy, Interior, FERC, you name it, in a program that, if you think about when Obama got elected and the Recovery Act and things like that, and how you're going to move fast and get money out and you transform what the United States is doing in energy, this is a much bigger deal. And so I just wanted to start this by saying this is a lot of responsibility. There's huge opportunities and also concerns. You remember when you first were in energy, you were working on how to get the Recovery Act money out quickly, in the same way, without scandal, but it couldn't take 5 years. It had to be committed and spent ideally in 2 years. And so now you have so much more money, and which is great. But how do you plan to coordinate all of this?
Well, first of all, thank you, Arun.
Please turn your mic on.
Okay. It's good to be here, and one of the, I have lots of fond memories of the Department of Energy under Steve Chu. One of the things that sticks out in my mind is, at one point, Secretary got really obsessed with the phantom energy consumption from things that are just plugged into the wall, and proceeded to really take things into his own hands and pulled out my printer from the wall because it wasn't in use and I was consuming energy. And so really hands-on Secretary. I think that it's a really important question. How do we coordinate for maximum impact in this moment when, after so many years of talking about climate legislation, talking about the solutions that we needed, we finally got a big installment of what we need. I think the important thing is, first of all, to recognize that we didn't solve the problem, that in many ways what we passed through the United States Congress was, the plywood, the nails, the hammers, but it's going to be on us to build the clean energy future that we want. So thing one is the architecture, the design, the delivery, the actual building has yet to be done. The second is, I think, and part of the reason I wanted to come here, part of the joy of being part of the adjunct faculty universe at Stanford, and spending time with STEM PhD students, was to push on a recognition, again, that if I think back to what Steve Chu did at the Department of Energy with the Sunshot program, you mentioned Ramesh Ramamurthy, who was at Berkeley Lab, came in, and we conceptualized, and this was literally sitting in the Secretary's office, talking about how we get to $1 a watt on solar. And as we're going through that process, a recognition that a lot of the costs live outside of the hardware that we needed to deploy. the balance of systems, labor, permitting, the systems of where the solar panel actually attaches, right? The tracker, and focusing our innovation energy, our brightest minds, not just on the wafer and the ingot and the panel efficiency, but on all of this, on all of it. And I think as we approach this $370 billion opportunity that we have, that's the approach we have to take, is to look at how we lower the costs of all of this transformation that needs to take place. And the other piece of it that I think is really important is continuing to be attentive to the political economy that made it possible for us to pass this legislation in the first place. And this is one of the reasons I've been in and out of politics a bit. One of the reasons I really gravitated towards President Biden and his vision for tackling the climate crisis. And really it's original to him in that he is a congenital optimist. But I think it's really something that was forged in particular by the young people who drove a movement in 2017 and 2018 and 2019. And it was this recognition that climate action was going to be not just a story of gloom and doom, not just the wildfires and the droughts and the surging seas that we see, but of hope and possibilities. And this, what this, I think, propelled for us was a brand of climate action that was delivered with three very specific things in mind, right? Number one, that there were these places all across America, like Rochester, where Steve grew up, like Erie, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, that had been looked over, left out, left behind, and that they could be part of the solution that we sought. That there were all of these people who felt like the climate transformation, these green jobs, were jobs on another planet, that they'd never be part of that transformation, that we had an opportunity to bring them in. And then this recognition that as long as we were talking about clean energy as blueprints and not as steel in the ground, it was gonna feel pie in the sky, and there would be no political economy to accelerate in that direction. So that was I think, the unique nature of moving us here. And maybe to sort of finish up answering Secretary Chu's first prompt here, the way we move forward is by reinforcing that political economy, by focusing on the people, by focusing on the places, by focusing on the projects, and by harmonizing the investments with the standards. And I think this part is key, because oftentimes, I think when you're, thinking about, let's take methane as an example, right? You're thinking about, okay, well, how do I reduce the cost or improve the efficacy of sensing technology? And we're through the infrastructure law, we're spending an unprecedented amount in reducing the cost of sensing technology, improving its efficacy. But that's not just a conversation to be had with companies and with investors and on the commercialization front. It's also a conversation to be had on the regulatory front. And so one of the things we've done is we actually propose a set of rules to dramatically reduce what oil and gas companies are allowed to emit. And we're able to set our sights that high, 85% reduction by the end of the decade, because we're pulling technology into the conversation around rules, not just investment. So that's how we, I think, maximize, is by looking at every one of these sources of emissions and then saying, how do we not just deploy investment, but how do we pull the entire regulatory apparatus behind it?
Well, actually with methane, it's great because that's something near my heart is infrared laser spectroscopy that allows remote sensing. And with remote sensing, we've learned that the oil and gas industry had these methane bursts that were huge, that could double, maybe quadruple what is being done. And so these things are very important. But there's so this is a great thing that you're doing. There are so many other things. For example, this huge opportunity to begin to do something about transmission in the United States, electricity transmission. despite nearly $400 million, you don't have enough. So you're gonna have to start and hope that that snowballs and gets private investment. So can you talk a little bit about that and gas pipelines? And, you know, we have a lagging infrastructure. There's an opportunity to get this thing going. And how do you and others decide?
Well, I think the transmission question, and it gets caught up in this broad discussion around permitting, and I think it's really important for us to distinguish like what it is we're talking about when we say permitting, because one of the big hangups in deploying clean energy, and we've got hundreds of gigs that are lined up to try to connect to the grid. The barrier is interconnection. And interconnection, part of the problem, sure, is that we need to build just more HVDC capacity, more transmission capacity generally. But part of it is this question of who pays, right? And part of it is, frankly, if we can be blunt here, is incumbent folks saying, oh, the new guy should have to carry all the costs. Well, that doesn't seem very fair, right? For 100 years, we built a system, we all pooled in on the costs, and now it's unsustainably dirty. And we know how to get it to be clean. We should figure out a way to allocate costs in a way that protects low and moderate income Americans, but in a way that does not create a barrier or a disincentive to bring those projects to market. So I think one of the things that we need to do is make sure more people see the economic benefit case for what this transformation will yield. And you know, one of the things that has been motivating, I think, the kind of progress we're seeing in Washington, but frankly seeing in states as well, is that where we get the policy right, we're seeing the states and the country really turn into a magnet for private investment. So the message to governors and to mayors and to county officials is, if you want to become a magnet for investment, get your policy mix right. And I think the more we tell that story, the more it's understood what that economic impact is going to be, the better. The other part of it, and this is where I think we sometimes get things wrong, right? There's a notion, I think, in climate policy that kind of sounds a lot like the notion we've had in economic policy circles, which is that, well, growth is good, right? That's the economic policy notion. Growth is good. You know, if you get left behind, you get hosed in the transformation, that's not my problem. Growth is good. We're gonna look at the GDP. Well, there's a version of that, and I might sound heretical, but there's a version of that in climate policy which says cutting emissions, that's good. What happens to people in the process, that's not my problem. I'm just a climate person. Well, one of the things that we have really grasped onto in the Biden administration is, if you do not have an unwavering prioritization of workers and communities, making sure all Americans in every zip code get lifted up in this transition, that will be the source of drag on your equation, right? So you may have figured out this brilliant way to get the grid to be green, but if you haven't thought through what are the distributional impacts of what that means for consumers and ratepayers, then you've got a big problem. So, you know, I think that that's one way. That's one place where we really need to spend this time, is when we come to these interconnection questions, we need to have that structured dialogue that's a different kind of economic dialogue than we've had before. And it's not just we're gonna jam these costs and we'll just figure out what happens, but actually on the front end being really purposeful about distributional impacts. Maybe the last thing I'll say, and again, this is a little bit more about the political economy of getting policies like interconnection, policies like permitting done, is expand the aperture of economic upside, right? So take, for example, Solar. So there was, and you know, this is being debated hotly on the in the Congress right now. So I'm maybe gonna get in trouble if I go too far. But there was a real issue about where our solar panels were coming from last year, summertime, and we found ourselves constrained by the fact that our supply chain largely exists overseas, and there were allegations, which the Commerce Department has subsequently investigated, that those supply chains were compromised, that they circumvented some of the rules of the road. And there was this big question, okay, what do you do about it? Do you stop the solar industry from growing at all? If you cut it off, will that help our manufacturing prowess? And the answer the president said was, look, we need to take 2 years and build a bridge. We will figure out a way to continue to bring panels in a way that's responsible, but we'll have a bridge, this 2-year period. And at the same time, we are going to throw our entire weight behind building a domestic capability to manufacture this stuff. 2 things to point to on this screen. Moses Lake in Washington State, there was a mill that had been shuttered. It used to make ingots and wafers, but then like so many clean energy industries, we waved to the jobs as they went offshore. Now that factory, in the last year, is back online, and it's got a 10-year contract to manufacture ingots and wafers that are gonna go to Georgia, to Arun's point. By the way, those 2 senators came up with the tax credit that made this possible. And that's gonna get stamped into solar panels that are made in the United States. That last facility, right outside of Pittsburgh, Bethlehem Steel, folks have heard this from like the industrial age. Big facility, totally gone, totally wiped out, brought down the whole community with it. Now, back to life. And you've got union workers who've turned a Bethlehem Steel factory into a Next Tracker facility. By the way, the largest clean energy IPO this past year, that's building trackers not just for the US, but for the export market, right? So it's, how do we show people that this is an opportunity not just to put solar panels out, but to make steel in America, and perhaps even more importantly, to put steel in the spine of the American middle class, which has been systematically disinvested in over the last several decades. A little off topic.
No,
Almost.
This is great. I mean, when you talk about the resistance you've been discovering since you were with me, but even more so now, resistance comes in strange ways, and how do you look at the whole picture, these other costs. There are a lot of people who say, well, we don't want to go in this direction, and so they will argue against transmission lines. They're arguing. So let me give you an example, and maybe I hope things are getting better. When I was secretary, it was 11 years between a siting of a transmission line, and so we met. The Interior was there, Salazar was there, CQ was there, everybody was there, and I said, can we get this from 11 years to 3 or 4 years? Okay, and
The answer is sadly still no, but we're working on it.
Okay, so Ken Salazar says, if we're going to do this, someone's going to be in charge. So I said, okay, I'll be in charge. And he says, great, that'll be great. And he calls me up half an hour after the meeting and says, I can't support this. Why not? Because people in my department don't want it to happen. Who's against it? Fish and Wildlife Game. They don't want transmission lines where they hunt and fish. And it was dead. So
Yeah.
So we've got to figure out how to, but the groundswell of actually transforming in America, getting jobs, bringing prosperity, very, very important to help overcome the incumbents. It's much easier to be able to stop things than to start things.
It is, and the breadth of the coalition, the resilience and durability of the coalition really matters. But look, I think there are a lot of hard conversations around the clean energy transition that we haven't figured out yet. and there's certainly not a global consensus on, let alone an American consensus. One example of that is conflicts with species, with not humans, but with biodiversity. If anything, the biodiversity crisis is blinking brighter, faster than aspects of the climate crisis. Don't want to pit one crisis against the other, but, but we are seeing precipitous decline of species diversity. And you know, when we have conversations about things like transmission, and we have live projects now that are facing this issue, it's a real big challenge. We value biodiversity, but at the same time, if we blow through 1.5 degrees, or 2, or 2.5, 3, then we have fundamentally undermined in an irreversible fashion biodiversity at a scale that we couldn't even have probably imagined a few decades ago. So look, I mean, that is the unglamorous. There are lots of parts about public service that are not glamorous, and notwithstanding being very clear about that, I actually managed, and Chris is one of my other co-faculty members, we did a class. I have managed to get students here who probably had much more lucrative careers to go work for peanuts on Capitol Hill. One of students Paul and I had in one of our early classes worked for Senator Markey. We have one who's working for Tina Smith now, who's an incredible proponent of the clean energy grid. But you know, this is the hard work of politics. People think politics is this, you know, the stuff those flashy ads with the, you know, the bum 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 music. That's politics. No, politics is the space that lives between policy and people. People, you know, the real life, the real experiences people feel, the choices they face, the things that they deal with at the kitchen table, and policy, which is we gotta make, you know, the grid this % clean by this year, we gotta catch the replacement cycle, and those things are in tension with one another, and they constantly are.
So let's talk about that, because you mentioned, again, going back to our time Department of Energy, if I look back, dozens of incredible young people, you know, Arun was young then, I was younger, and people in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, the quality of people who came into the Department of Energy during that term was amazing, and I frankly, you know, I'm a little worried because that big dozens of really first-rate, top-notch people who could go anywhere and they were willing to come and work for the government for peanuts because they believed in the mission, is not there as much as I saw, at least from my perspective, in 2009 to 2013 to now. And how do you get, it's not only in the White House, but in the agencies.
Yeah.
You know, the EPA, the Energy, Interior, you know, NOAA, all these people. How do you get young people to say, it's really worth it, you know, and we were trying to say, we had no problem, you know, we're here to save the world, and lots of people are sharing it. And so is there, you know, the idealist enthusiasm, the way we got back when Obama first got elected, is hard to match.
Yeah.
But how, you know, because in the end, it's about people. It's about the quality of people, and it's the quality of people in the trenches that actually begin to get the work done. So how do you propose to get a new idealism? People from Stanford to go in for the government?
Well, I think good news, bad news. So many good news, bad news opportunities when you work in government. But good news, bad news. I think the bad news is it probably is harder to get some talented folks to show up. We're really competing out there, and it is like hard. So for anyone who's like, you know, I want to work in the first $27 billion green bank that the country has ever tried to stand up, that's going to be focused on delivering clean energy finance to communities that are often left behind. You want to sign up? We can get you a job. For folks who want to sign up, not just to be part of environmental justice going forward, but on the work of repair, communities that, for example, are literally hotter because of a racist housing policy, making sure we're dealing with the challenge of a place where there's fewer trees and more pavement, and getting a new ecosystem in those communities. There are jobs for you. But I think the good news is, I don't think we're losing folks to go take some soulless job just churning out Bitcoin, right? I hope not. That's not an administration policy position. We are
That's a good policy.
using just absolutely way too much energy, by the way. And just as an aside, the crypto market has to get its act together on being clearer about disclosing its environmental footprint and making sure that from here on forward, that the path forward has to be done in a way that does not contribute to the carbon crisis that we have. But that's a tangent for another day. The good news is, what we're competing with is that every sector of the economy now has a place for folks to step up and be part of the clean energy solution set. And I think when you were at Department of Energy, the agriculture sector probably wasn't the place we looked to and said, oh, climate solutions is growing out of the ground, right? That was not necessarily part of the table stakes discussion on climate. Today, President Biden got up there on his first joint session address to Congress, and he talked about cover crops. And people said, oh, he's just pandering. Well, it's not pandering when you then go and sign up 60,000 farms, 25 million acres of working land, and create a whole revolution in agriculture, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. And by the way, and this is an important point when we talk about talent, that's Tuskegee College, a historically black university. We need to field the full team on climate change. Every single person, the climate generation of workers, the folks forging solutions, whether in agriculture or in industry or in the power sector or transportation, they need to look like America. And that's a tough conversation for industries, by the way, that have not looked like America, and kind of on purpose. But this is our moment to break down those barriers. So, I think we do struggle. There's a really tight talent market out there. But the good news is, one, that talent pool is expanding, and two, it's just got a lot of places to go all across the economy.
Yeah, but you still want both your people.
But we want the best people to work in the climate policy office of the White House.
Well, or the agencies, because
Yeah.
in the agencies have the budget.
They do.
And
They do.
and
I'm
because-
familiar with that.
And so if you've got the money, you can do stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we politely listen to the people in the White House.
There was this great dynamic where we're negotiating with Congress on what would become first the bipartisan infrastructure law and then the Inflation Reduction Act, and all the agencies, every cabinet member just like calling you on your cell phone, like, what do you need? Like, how's my pet project doing in the negotiations? Everyone, just a long line. And then the bill passed, can't find them. No, I'm kidding. They're having a great time.
You want to? Yeah. So where do you see some of the other things in terms of? You talked a little about in this transition, and during Obama, we were very conscious of this. We want to transform essentially the economy in the United States. And as you go to a clean energy economy, it's a very different thing, and livelihoods get people who lose their jobs, things like that. I remember touring around with Jay Rockefeller and Joe Manchin in West Virginia, trying to figure out what do you do, because if yes, you want coal to become obsolete, but you have to figure out what to do with the people in Olson, Wyoming, all these other things. So these are things where there are real livelihoods, people's lives being disrupted. And what do you do in order to say, yes, there's a better way? The government can help you, because the people who don't want to change are saying that you're ruining people's lives, you're ruining people's neighborhoods, even states. And so, what would be your answer to that?
Well, first of all, and I think it's important to say the same thing no matter what the audience is, so let me just do that. I think in this administration, one of the things we've been very particular about is not ruling out fuel source. So we have made the largest investment ever into carbon capture sequestration. We've made the largest investment in nuclear, alongside making the largest investment in storage and renewables and wind and so on and so forth. So, when we look at the equation, we say best path, fastest path to cutting the emissions out of the system. So part of the solution, where the economics pencil out, and that's not going to be everywhere, but is going to be to potentially retrofit existing coal plants, keep them running, but without emissions. Part of the solution is being really attentive to when that's not the case. And this actually goes to the interconnection challenge that we have. So there are a bunch of coal plants around the country that either have retired or are going to retire. They're interconnected to the grid, right? So you don't have to spend time in a queue, think about grid upgrades as much. And that's why the president went to one of what was the largest coal plant in New England over the summer. And that's going to be the plug-in point for a bunch of offshore wind. And we're taking advantage of the place to actually create manufacturing and port operations there. In New Mexico, there's a coal plant that went out of business. They're refiring that with hydrogen that's going to be essentially harnessing renewables, storing it, and then providing sort of a baseload feature through a hydrogen plant. In Wyoming, we're taking a coal plant that used to run and replacing it with an advanced nuclear reactor that's going to be able to tap into the IRA tax credit. So thing one is, and I think this is really important, when you say to somebody, hey, you live in zip code where I grew up, 16412, and we'll have a job for you. It's just the job's in 20001. You've got to drive to Washington, D.C. for it. Or, for an example the president likes to give, he's like, you walk into any business school, I'm sure we can do this at GSB, you walk into any business school and say to all the MBA students, we're not going to need MBAs anymore, but we have a job for you as a butcher. They're going to say, no, I trained my life for this. This is my ambition. These are my hopes and dreams. So I think thing number one is not just creating a job, but using the skills people have and creating it in the community they're used to living in. The second goes to that economic diversification point. One of our colleagues from the Department of Energy actually started this company, Sparks. They're building a battery factory in West Virginia, and they're training United Mine Workers union members who used to go dig for coal to work at that battery facility. That's the kind of thinking we need to have if we're going to stay on this trajectory. I don't know if people remember the Yellow Jackets. Y'all remember the Yellow Jackets? So, really great climate policy came out in Paris. And then people took to the streets wearing yellow jackets. And the way I think about it is you're either going to have those people feeling bought in to the economic upside of the transformation because we thought about it, or they're going to feel left behind, and that's going to be drag on the system. So if we believe we're in this decisive decade, we got to move quickly, well then we got to deal everyone in to the equation.
I'm going to start to open it up for general discussions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Okay, and but before I do, I think I'd be remiss in not raising some issue that's happened in the news as of today. And it has to do with the willow oil. And so, describe your take on, this to the audience.
Yeah, look, I think we're all in a place where every single day we're confronted with what the climate crisis is bringing into our communities, right? And California is the front lines of that. You've seen the skies turn red. You've seen the warnings come across your phone to curtail water use. It's not some IPCC report concept. It's real life that's felt here. And I think our reaction to that is, okay, well, we've got to now flip the switch and turn off the thing that's causing this problem. And I think the president ran on this notion that we've got to go as quickly as possible to do that, but with the recognition that there isn't one switch to flip. For a lot of people, the car that's parked at the end of their driveway, or realistically, on the street somewhere, right, because they don't have a driveway, is gonna be the car that's parked there tomorrow. And we're working really hard to get battery costs to come down, electric vehicles deployed, charging infrastructure out there. But we've gotta meet those people where they are, and that's just part of the reality. So that's, I think, a broader commentary on both the lived reality and experience, but then the modeled reality of how long we're gonna need liquid fuels, and probably how long we're gonna need significant amount of liquid fuels that are hydrocarbon, petroleum based. California has this very aggressive target to start selling 100% electric vehicles 2035, right? The governor issued a ban. That means from 2035, you only have new vehicles be electric. Well, there are a lot of cars on the road. Scrappage rate for cars actually has been going up because we've started making much better cars. So it used to be about 11, 12 years, now it's 15, 16, 17 years. So you start at 2035 selling 100% electric, you're gonna have scrappage for a while. Now, there are programs that we know work, like cash for clunkers, that can accelerate scrappage, right? And by the way, we proposed that in the Build Back Better plan, and I hope that sometime we come back to that question, because I think that's gonna be important for us to accelerate the ability of people to get out of the car that sucks up a bunch of their paycheck and get into a car that saves the money, which is why this administration for the first time has created a used electric vehicle tax credit. Because there are a lot of people, like my folks when they moved to the United States, who, our first car was like a Oldsmobile built in the early 80s, right? And if you told my parents when they came here, oh, you should just buy an electric vehicle, they'd say, well, I can't go buy a new electric vehicle. Maybe their second car, when they traded in the Oldsmobile, maybe they would have gotten a used EV if there were a used EV tax credit, right? So thinking through that part. So that's thing one, is what is the sort of physical reality and what's the modeled reality. Thing two is, what are just the constraints of the legacy of decisions we've made as a country, right? And that gets more in particular to the decision that was made by the Interior Department today. So, Jim Hansen, 1988, 1987, got up there, gave a talk in front of the United States Congress. That was the first time we hit 350 parts per million. By the way, when I was born, right? Since then, we went from 350, 375, 400. Over the course of that time, we've made a ton of decisions that make this problem harder. One of those decisions is we kept selling these cars that keep us hooked on gasoline, right? 10, 15 million cars a year.
I should put it in context. When I first became secretary, I didn't realize how touchy the price of gasoline was. 6 months before that, I was giving a talk, and someone asked in the question and answer period, why can't American cars be as economical as European cars? There's factor 2, they're averaging 20, 25 miles a gallon. European cars average 40, 45. So I said, well, I think price matters, and if we could somehow get the price of gasoline up to the price of European gasoline, they too will buy more.
I'm disassociating myself with Secretary's work.
I'm going to explain the context. What I said in that question and answer period after my talk, 6 months ago, is I was reminded of the 4.5 years I was Secretary of Energy. And I never realized when you're there at a gas pump and you're watching and your things going ding, 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 your dollars are going into the gas tank, how if you want to raise the price by putting a gasoline tax on it, it's impossible for any Republican or any Democrat. I remember second year, Jeff Bingaman taking me aside and saying, Steve, you gotta understand, the federal tax on gasoline is 19.2 or 3 cents a gallon. He says, you will not be able to raise it 0.1 cent per gallon. It will be dead on arrival. The last time it was adjusted was in 1992, and nobody will vote for raising the gasoline tax even a half a penny forever.
Still true.
And it is still true. And I thought about this and says, yes, it's fully in keeping with the second golden rule in DC of politics, which is get reelected. If you voted to raise the tax, you're going to get unelected, for sure. and so then
Have it under control. I think about, there was this front page, and I'll stop so we can go to people. But I think there was this moment over the summer which really sort of crystallized for me why I do this work. There was this front page of the Flagstaff, New Mexico newspaper that talked about this public school district for the Navajo Nation had received its first shipment of electric vehicles. And I just for a second thought about the hundreds of times I got on the school bus, and I thought about the kid who gets on the school bus and it starts to move and there's no roar of the diesel engine. There's no inhaling of that gunk, all those toxic pollutants. And I just thought about what that kid feels. That kid feels a sense that in this country we prioritized her well-being. That we decided in the scheme of all of this, with 250 million vehicles on the road, that we were going to put public dollars, not just a tax credit, but a rebate to swap out that iconic yellow school bus and make it green, not just for a planetary solution, but for a local pollution, for public health, for reasons of justice. So, look, I get when folks feel angry, when we feel like we're taking a step back. I think the answer is not to not feel the emotion. I think the answer is to translate that into how do we get to work harder on behalf of our kids and the next generation.
Okay, thank you. So